Good afternoon, Excellencies, friends, and welcome to today's virtual policy conference, jointly organized by the World Trade Organization Secretariat, CropLife International, and us at the Geneva Trade Platform. My name is Dmitry Gozubinski, and it's my pleasure to make a few opening remarks before I throw it over to our co-moderators and our illustrious panel. The event today is entitled International Trade and Global Food Supply Chains. It serves two related purposes. First and foremost, it's an opportunity to reflect as an international trade policy community on the state of play in food security, and more specifically on the role international trade and global supply chains can play in ensuring it. But second, it serves as a preparatory policy dialogue for our hackathon on international trade and food security, co-hosted by the three organizing partners of this webinar. This innovative initiative brings together graduate, postgraduate, PhD, and postdoctoral and recently graduated students from around the world and challenges them to develop practical policy proposals on how trade can support food security. I am thrilled to see so many of the 57 teams from over 30 countries that have registered joining us here today, and I'm really looking forward to see what they will prepare for us. For those who have never seen one of our hackathons, during the hackathon, which will take place on the last weekend of August, so that is the 30th to the 31st of August, participants will work in interdisciplinary teams to tackle a real-world challenge, such as how international trade in food can strengthen our climate resilience, reduce food loss and waste, and many, many other potential challenges. The hackathon aims to invite fresh thinking into the relationship between international trade and food security, and it is my hope that today's dialogue will help frame some of the issues that hackathon participants will help to grapple with, as well as being informative to all attendees. So a special welcome to our hackathon participants, but really to you all. Let me say a big thank you to all of the teams at the WTO Secretariat, CropLife, and my own colleagues at the Geneva Trade Platform for putting this webinar together, to their excellencies and Edwini for joining us for an illustrious panel, and to pass the floor to our co-moderators of today's session. Doa, Emily, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dimitri, and hello, everyone. My name is Doa Abdelmotal. I'm Senior Counselor in the WTO Agriculture and Commodities Division, and I'll be moderating today's conversation alongside Emily Rees, President and CEO of CropLife International. We're gathered today to discuss a topic of pressing global relevance, the role of international trade and global food supply chains in ensuring food security. I want to start by saying a few words about this topic to create some context for the dialogue. Let me begin with a simple but powerful truth. Trade is absolutely essential for global food security. At the global level, 1/4 of all of the food produced is traded internationally. 1/4. Every single day, the world exchanges nearly 5,000 trillion kilocalories across borders, more than double the volume traded in the year 2000. To make this more visual, daily per capita food trade has grown from around 900 to 1,600 kilocalories over the last 25 years. Today, the value of global food and agricultural trade has reached nearly $2 trillion, making it one of the most important sectors of world trade. And we need to be clear, the world trades in food not as a luxury, but really as a must. Where countries sit on the map is no more than an accident of geography. If international trade were to stop, over 30 countries would face complete starvation. Think of Gulf Arab countries, which import 80 to 90% of their food. Move your globe over to Asia. Singapore in Asia imports 80% of its food. Move your globe over to the Americas. A country like Haiti imports 40% of its food. These are not exceptions. They are the rule in a world that relies on trade to feed itself. But it's not just about calories. It's also about nutrition. Trade has dramatically increased the diversity of food that is available to us for consumption. In 2010, the number of foods available for consumption globally was about 60% higher than what countries could produce domestically. Today, that figure is at 90%. This is why we now have fresh fruits and vegetables all year round and access to an array of nutritious foods from all over the globe. It's not a coincidence then that life expectancy has risen so significantly. Dietary diversity has certainly played a role. Trade can also help us meet the climate challenge by allowing for the optimal use of land, water, and energy. Trade contributes to the sustainable use of these natural resources. As the United Nations Development Programme has once told my country, achieving food self-sufficiency would require 3 river Niles, not 1. Simply put, we must grow food where it makes sense to do so. And increasingly, food is no longer made in a single country. It is assembled in the world, just like an iPhone or a car. In fact, processed food is now the fastest growing segment of global food trade. According to the FAO, 1/3 of global food and agricultural exports cross borders at least twice. In short, our food system today is more interconnected than ever before. This is why this conversation is so vital, and that is why the work ahead, both in this policy dialogue and in the hackathon to follow, matters so deeply. I'm incredibly excited about the numbers that Dimitri from the Geneva Trade Platform has just cited, 57 teams from over 30 countries. With that, let me hand the floor to Emily Rees, President and CEO of CropLife International, who has agreed to sponsor this hackathon. Emily, over to you.
Thank you, Doa, and thank you, Dimitri, and to all your excellencies also for being here today and for all of you joining us online as we prepare to address one of the most pressing challenges we collectively face: how to feed a growing global population sustainably, putting less strain on the world's resources while increasing our productivity. Doa, your powerful words there about interconnectedness of food supply and its relationship to our security, health, geography, and climate leave us in no doubt about the profound impact that global food trade has upon our lives and livelihoods, on our very existence. That's not a question or an opinion or a policy stance. It's a fact. So are we getting it right? Are the systems, the rule books, the agreements, legislations, regulations, all up to the challenge of feeding a global population of over 9 billion by 2050? I think the answer is yes. And at the same time, we are at risk. Why? The multilateral trading system, open and rules-based, upon which the work of my esteemed colleagues at the World Trade Organization is predicated, provides the framework to keep food flowing fairly and transparently around the globe, supporting societies and economies alike. And it works. It underpins food supply and food security. But of course, we cannot always regulate for the most capricious of the things, the unexpected. Today, climate shocks and geopolitical fragility have the potential to cause seismic disruption in our global trading system. Droughts, floods, and conflict can undo years of stability. And now with climate shocks, exporters of today can become the importers of tomorrow. What we need to do as our planet warms, as our biodiversity shrinks and our population grows, is to bake in resilience. And as the world fragments, some of the old economic models are increasingly appearing to no longer be viable or politically realistic. So global cooperation is about to be tested like never before. Alongside resilience, the other prerequisite is innovation. Just as trade will continue across borders, farmers will continue to farm around the world. But they need new technologies enabled with practical regulations and policy to help them feed this rapidly growing population. We know that regulatory convergence and adherence to international norms are essential to facilitate this transparent, predictable, and open trade. Non-adherence to fair and rules-based multilateral trade system cuts off the oxygen of innovation to our farmers, reducing their toolbox just when they need the widest available range of products, ingredients, and methodologies. So as we look to the challenges ahead, How, therefore, do we increase trade resilience and unlock the innovation to enable us to step boldly into our future with confidence? Is it through reinforcing our standard-setting bodies, such as Codex Alimentarius, or is it through a greater adherence to the rule book? I have no doubt that by the end of one exhilarating and exhausting weekend in August, we will have expanded our own toolbox of solutions to these questions and challenges exponentially, which is where our participants come in. Welcome to you all, ladies and gentlemen, to the Hackathon on International Trade and Food Security.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you very much for these opening remarks. Very powerful words. The exporters of today may become the importers of tomorrow. With those words, let me now introduce our very distinguished panel to you all of whom will bring deep insight and experience to this topic. Ambassador Sofia Boza Martinez, Permanent Representative of Chile to the WTO. Welcome, Ambassador. Ambassador Kadra Ahmed Hassan, Permanent Representative of Djibouti to the WTO. Welcome, Ambassador. Ambassador Manuel Tihanki, Permanent Representative of the Philippines to the WTO. Welcome, Ambassador. And Edwini Kessi, Director of the Agriculture and Commodities Division of the WTO. Hello, Edwini. Let me start with the first round of questions. And Edwini, I will start immediately with you for some scene setting. When most people imagine the global food supply chain, they probably think of farmers growing produce, manufacturers transforming it, and transport firms delivering it. But where does the WTO come in?
Thank you, Doa, for the question. And let me join Dimitri, Emily, and yourself in welcoming all the participants to today's event, and in particular, those who will be joining us for the upcoming Hackathon on International Trade and Food Security. The Hackathon will take place on the eve of the WTO Public Forum, a moment when the WTO opens its doors to engage with the outside world, who are able then to put forward their ideas on how issues should be tackled or addressed at the WTO. Having this engagement is necessary because of the global challenges we face together, from hunger to climate change. All these require fresh thinking, practical proposals, and diverse perspectives. The Hackathon is a vital space for that creativity to flourish. Now, where does the WTO come into the food supply chain? Let me answer this by taking you on a short journey through the making of a simple loaf of bread, which I think a lot of people survive on bread around the world. That loaf might begin with wheat grown in a country with the right conditions: soil, sunlight, rainfall. Here, the WTO's agreement on agriculture comes into play. It governs the rules around domestic support, market access, export competition. These rules help to ensure that wheat can be grown where it is most efficient to do so and traded fairly, and that subsidies or other trade barriers do not distort the playing field. But wheat alone does not make bread. It needs fertilizer, which is often imported, and machinery to harvest and process it. This brings us to industrial goods. WTO rules and tariffs and on non-tariff barriers to trade ensure that tractors, combined harvesters, packaging equipment, and even the ovens that bake the bread can cross borders without unnecessary cost or friction. Then comes the services element: transport, logistics, finance, telecommunications. Without them, the grain doesn't move from the farm to the mill, from the mill to the bakery, and finally to the supermarket. Here, WTO rules on trade in services ensure that the arteries of the food system remains open and competitive. And finally, there is also an element of intellectual property, from improved seed varieties to milling technologies to brand protection on packaged goods. The TRIPS agreement plays a role in encouraging innovation while balancing access, ensuring that science and knowledge that underpin modern food systems can be shared and safeguarded. In short, that loaf of bread is not just a mere product of agriculture. It is a product of international trade and of a multilateral system that touches every stage of the journey. A loaf of bread literally travels through all four corners of the WTO rulebook: rules on agricultural trade, industrial product, services, and intellectual property. This brings me to a final important point. Our current WTO rules were written decades ago. Since then, the world has changed significantly. The trade landscape has also changed, notwithstanding the achievement of WTO agricultural rules, which have underpinned the expansion of global trade. I think Doha made mention of the fact that world agricultural trade, has expanded significantly. The amount last year was close to $2 trillion. And this is partly due to the contribution of the Agreement on Agriculture. Notwithstanding that, there are still distortions, including high tariffs. The tariffs on agricultural products are twice as high as those on industrial products. Export restrictions, unsustainable domestic support measures and practices, and outdated disciplines, which invariably impede the flow of food from countries that have it in surplus to those that need it. This is why the ongoing WTO agriculture negotiations are so essential. If we get them right, we can build a food system that is more resilient, more inclusive, and better able to withstand future shocks, whether from geopolitical tensions or the climate crisis. This is what is at stake. And that is why your ideas through this dialogue and through the hackathon matter so much. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Idwini, for the journey of a loaf of bread, indeed, with bread traveling, as you said, across all four corners of the WTO rulebook. Thank you so much for this very visual example. Ambassador Tihanki, let me come to you. WTO agriculture negotiations are something that few outside of the WTO building get a chance to witness. How would you explain to the outside world how these negotiations work, the different coalitions that exist, and the agricultural reform process that lies before the WTO?
Thank you, Doa. First of all, of course, it's a pleasure to join all of you virtually for today. And I thank the WTO Secretariat, the Global Trade Platform, and CropLife International for bringing us all together. And welcome also the voices of the young innovators that are participating in this special hackathon. So we look forward to the ideas that will come out of this hackathon. And directly to your question, indeed, what is the outside world looking at the WTO? We hear a lot of discussions that the WTO has 165, 166 members. How can that many countries negotiate with each other and reach a result? And so indeed, it is a bit complex, but in the agricultural arena and the negotiations, what happens is that we will have to build coalitions with like-minded members. In agriculture, basically there are three pillars. One is market access, which emphasizes accessibility to export markets. Then there is domestic support issue, the pillar, which relates to subsidies and the amount of government support that can be provided without overly distorting the market. And then, of course, export competition, which is assistance to exporters. Embedded in these three issues is the development pillar, which is that all of our efforts towards the agriculture negotiations must have a win for development, meaning less poverty, food security for all, and the opportunity for our farmers to profit. So the coalitions arise, for example, the Cairns Group, which the Philippines is a member. Their focus is on the challenge of addressing developed country subsidies, large subsidies that distort the market. When large subsidies are provided to agricultural goods, then there is a limitation of the open market and the competitiveness from developing countries. So the members of the Cairns Group focus on reducing trade distorting domestic support of many developed countries. Another coalition focuses on development issues, livelihoods of farmers. The G33, which is also where we coalesce, the Philippines is a member of, focuses on providing safeguards and protections to domestic farmers so that increased exports do not unnecessarily damage the livelihoods of our farmers. So those are just examples how coalitions work. One has to really have an open, collaborative effort towards what Edwini has said before. That is the goal of all the WTO members is actually a better world, better food security, and a win-win for all. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Ambassador Tihanki, for those words. And thank you for reminding us of the development pillar, an unspoken pillar that is in the room with us all the time in the WTO. A pillar that pushes us, as you mentioned, to think about poverty, food security, the livelihood of farmers. Absolutely, everything we do in the WTO on food has to have development at the center, and indeed does. And thank you very much for explaining to hackathon participants how the coalitions work and so on. Before I move to Ambassador Botza Martinez, let me just ask participants or remind participants that they can put their questions as we go on in the Q&A button that they see at the bottom of their screens where you have a question mark. Feel free as we go on to enter your questions there, and we will take them, of course, to the Q&A portion of this webinar. Ambassador Botza, the world has gone from a COVID pandemic to wars on various fronts and major supply chain disruptions. How has all of this impacted global food security, and what have we learned about the vulnerabilities of the global food supply chain?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to be part of this event. And thank you for your question, Doa, which I will address from my country's experience. From Chile's standpoint, the recent global disruptions, while undeniable challenging, have also served as a powerful catalyst for innovation and a deeper understanding of food system resilience. We have witnessed not just vulnerabilities, but also remarkable adaptability within the global food supply chain, leading to crucial advancements. The COVID-19 pandemic and subsequent geopolitical events did indeed send shockwaves, causing price volatility and logistical bottlenecks. However, the intrinsic dynamism of the global food system, combined with proactive responses, allowed for a relative swift recalibration. While disruptions in shipping and rising energy costs did present hurdles, the agility of our producers and exporters, coupled with the strong international trade agreements, enabled us to largely maintain and even increase our export flows. Following one of your introductory remarks, Toa, this was not merely about maintaining volume, but also about a commitment with ensuring the availability of diverse and nutritious food options, which is crucial for global food security. Beyond the immediate challenges of recent turbulences, these events have spurred significant positive developments, as I mentioned. First, accelerated digitalization. The necessity of remote operations during the pandemic dramatically accelerated the adoption of digital technologies in agriculture. Second, enhanced problem-solving speed. The urgency of the crisis boost intense collaboration between private and public sector. Third, greater focus on supply chain visibility and traceability. Producers and government are now more acutely aware of the need for transparent and resilient supply chains. And finally, I will highlight an increased innovation in production. The recognition of vulnerabilities has spurred innovation in production methods, including renewed interest in sustainable practices, water-efficient technologies, and controlled environment agriculture, all contributing to a more secure and adaptable food supply. In essence, in sum, while the recent global landscape presented formidable challenges, of course, we think it also illuminated the inherent resilience of the global food system and accelerated the adoption of forward-thinking strategies. In the specific case of Chile, these experiences have not only highlighted our vital role in global food provision, but have also empowered us to further strengthen our capacities and contribute to a more secure and sustainable future for global food security. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Boats, for this. I would say that your comments fall into two categories. The first is that the dynamism of the global food system, as you've called it, has been hugely beneficial because it has allowed countries to find alternative suppliers fairly quickly and therefore to become more resistant to food shocks. So that's point number one in your remarks, and I think that that's a very important point, and I hope that hackathon participants have taken note. And then, of course, the second category of your remarks lies in the fact that in all of those shocks, there has been a very important opportunity that has been seized by the trading system to digitalize, to solve problems, to trace food, and to innovate. So with shocks come opportunities. Thank you very, very much for these thoughtful comments. Ambassador Hassan, let me turn to you. Here in the WTO, Ambassador Hassan, you speak on behalf of least developed countries on the issue of agriculture. Djibouti itself is an LDC and faces serious food insecurity and imports the bulk of its food. From your perspective, what are some of the areas where the multilateral trading system could do more to meet the needs, the food security needs of least developed countries?
Thank you, Doha. And first of all, I would like to thank the WTO, CropLife International, and the Geneva Trade Platform for organizing this event and inviting Djibouti to share some thoughts on the trade and food security nexus. And good day to all participants and my colleagues. I want to thank you, Doha and Emily, as well as Edwini, for setting the stage and highlighting the importance of trade and international supply chains in contributing to food security and resilient agricultural system. To answer directly your question, yes, Djibouti is an LDC, but also a net food importing an NFIDC as well, like many other LDCs. And I want to maybe start by saying that after several decades of progress in eradicating food insecurity, we have witnessed a renewed increase in supply chain disruptions. The impacts of climate change have also started affecting crop yields, productivity, and ultimately food security. Most LDCs rely on import, as you indicated yourself, for their food, but not only LDCs, but for the LDCs is really a prevalent issue, and nutrition security. So we rely a lot on imports. Over the last 25 years, food imports represented on average 17% of total LDC import and up to 21% in certain years. While growth in GDP, population and urbanization have contributed to increasing demand for food, persistent supply side constraints have limited the potential for domestic production to meet this growing demand. As a result, the trade balance of LDCs as a whole has significantly deteriorated over the last 30 years. At the same time, the share of agricultural production, which is traded internationally, is on average 23% as highlighted by Doha, but it's even less for key staple foods such as rice and maize. This results in a growing number of importing countries depending on an increasingly small number of large exporters. So the question for me would be, what can the multilateral trading system can do to help LDCs meet their food and nutrition security needs, and in a more global term, if we were to take the food security needs? The MTS must be supportive of efforts by developing countries, including NFIDCs and LDCs, to strengthen their own productive capacity. Over the past 20 years, we have seen numerous episodes of price spikes and supply chain disruptions. these episodes have had a direct impact on the food import bill of LDCs. Some export restrictions applied by large net food exporting countries during these times high and volatile prices have further exacerbated price spikes, with direct impact on the ability of LDCs and NFIDCs to access the food they needed. In the WTO, the LDC group proposed that net exporting countries refrain from applying such export restriction to LDCs and NFIDCs importing these foodstuffs for their internal consumption. The intention here is not to prohibit the temporary application of export prohibition or restrictions to prevent critical shortage of food products, but simply to exempt imports for domestic use by LDCs and NFIDCs. Beyond export restriction, a key issue relates to public stock holding for food security purposes. Not all countries have the ability to build stocks and release them at affordable prices. In the absence of global food stocks, it will be important to ensure that those who have the capacity to accumulate such stocks are allowed to export them to other governments at affordable prices in times of crisis. This may require adjustment to existing rules dealing with export subsidies. But I think we all know the complication in the discussion in the WTO about that issue. Another point I would like to make is the need to support efforts by developing countries, including NFIDCs and LDCs, to strengthen their productive capacity. The multilateral trading system has a critical role to play in removing trade distorting subsidies in large producing countries, which generate unfair competition. LDCs do not have the same fiscal space to compete with subsidized exports, and ultimately this discourages most needed investment in agriculture in LDCs. At the same time, we would ensure that existing WTO disciplines do not unduly constrain the ability of LDCs to overcome their supply side constraint by supporting their domestic production. I want to mention a few key areas, mainly two, of concerns for LDCs. And the first one is the current Bali decision on public stock holding for food security, which does not apply to existing or future programs by LDCs, simply because those were not in place at the time of the decision. And the second one is any permanent solution to this issue, therefore, needs to also benefit future LDC programs and ensure that it covers key staple food for LDCs and NFIDCs. And I thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Kadra, for this. And your remarks show how important it is for us to have invited you to this webinar. It's key for us to understand the food needs of LDCs and their negotiating position in WTO. I think you clarified that in addition to being an LDC, you are a net food importing country, as are many other LDCs, and that your interests in the multilateral trading system, therefore, lie in the issue of food export restrictions, the public stockholding of food, and so on. And I'm sure that these are issues that Emily will go into in the second round of questions. So Emily, let me hand over to you.
Thank you, Doa. Thank you, Ambassadors Edwini, for your insights that clearly outlined the challenges that we face. Turning to you, Ambassador Tihanki, like many other countries in Asia, the Philippines is faced with a serious food security challenge, and in particular for one of its most vital staple crops, rice. It often has to import rice from other Asian partners and also has to contend there with growing calls for food nationalism in the region. So in this context, how is the Philippines leveraging trade and innovation to address these challenges? And what are the lessons that we can learn from ASEAN's approach that could offer some valuable insights to us in terms of strengthening this global trading system? Ambassador.
Thank you very much for this question. Indeed, rice as the main staple in the Philippines and rice security is a central concern for our country, as it is for many other countries in Asia. Though, of course, our neighbors, some are very good productivity and rice exporters. So we count on our neighbors' surpluses for the rice shortages in the Philippines. Currently, we probably import between 10 to 15% of our rice needs. And our archipelagic geography and exposure to climate risks compound the challenge. If there is a large weather disturbance, it really can disrupt our rice crop production. So basically, in the WTO and our interest in the WTO and the ASEAN community is food security in its three aspects. One is the efficiency of production, improving it constantly, which means also sustainability and profitability for the farmers. So efficiency goes hand in hand with sustainable profit. The second is productivity. Through innovation and technology, that is one of the Philippines is home to the International Rice Research Institute, which has instituted all kinds of research to increase productivity. And the third, which is of course you highlighted with our ASEAN colleagues and family, is we need to cooperate, collaborate, and partner with other rice producers and other economic partners. In this context, Philippines will leverage its trade policy as part of a broader food security strategy, which is by diversifying our import sources, modernizing our agriculture, and promoting innovation. One of the recent reforms is the rice tariffication law, which liberalized rice importation, brought down tariffs. And while lowering tariffs, this has also led to increased revenue for our government. And one unique feature of the rice liberalization law is that we use a portion of the tariffs to help mechanization, funding for the farmers, improve seeds, and the supply chain, the domestic supply chain, so as to increase the competitiveness and efficiency of our rice farmers. On regional cooperation, the ASEAN Plus 3 has a emergency rice reserve program, APTER. It's a practical mechanism for food security cooperation among ASEAN partners. And so with the ASEAN, which is a smaller microcosm of the WTO community, we do it by consensus, we balance national interests, we balance importers and exporter interests, and farmer livelihood concerns and development. I guess the lesson for us is trade and food security are not exclusive. They must complement each other. Through cooperation, collaboration in trade, we can achieve better food security, better productivity, and efficiency.
Thank you, Ambassador. A very clear, I think, outline there from the Philippines in terms of the efficiency of production that matches sustainability and profitability for farmers. We're looking at productivity and promoting that innovation through research and technology, and how governments can also support the regulatory frameworks to enable that. And then finally, partnerships to build that diversification of trade that is so important in the light of those climate shocks that you mentioned. Maybe if you'll allow me now to turn to Edwini, we're seeing this rise of export restrictions and other trade barriers, and especially for some of these really important crops, especially during crises. This is a phenomenon that's sometimes referred to as food nationalism. How can the World Trade Organization better respond to these practices while balancing, obviously, the legitimate interest of countries to boost their domestic production with the benefits of an open international trade? Do you see the mechanisms of transparency and cooperation playing a role in this context? Are there any moves that we can make, and is there a challenge here for our students online?
Thank you, Emily, for this question. As we are preparing for MC14, a number of our members have stressed the need for us to reach a package for the most vulnerable countries. And this relates mainly to food security. So it is a very important issue. Now, on the issue of food nationalism or food sovereignty, this is kind of a reflex to either attempt to produce all your food needs, even under uncompetitive conditions, or restrict exports to protect domestic supplies in times of crisis. On the face of it, it would seem to be a prudent policy, but it runs the risk of creating global food insecurity. Of course, there are situations where such measures may be justified, and indeed, WTO rules do allow for them. If you look at even the decision we reached in 2022, exempting the purchases of the World Food Programme from the imposition of export restrictions, paragraph 2 of that decision basically also acknowledged that where a country's own food security is at stake, then they can even restrict purchases by the World Food Programme. So the WTO does recognize the explicit right of countries to impose measures to guarantee their own food security. Now, there are other situations where the imposition of export restrictions may seem questionable. Let me explain with a real-world example. During the 2008 food price crisis, over 30 countries imposed export bans on grains, including rice and wheat. And we saw the result. Global prices tripled in a matter of months. This wasn't driven by actual shortage. It was driven by panic and policy contagion. One country imposes a ban, others follow suit, and suddenly the market seizes up. We saw the same dynamic during the COVID-19 pandemic. At the height of these crises, over 80 WTO members introduced export restrictions, many of them on food products, but as well as on key agricultural inputs such as fertilizers and protective equipment essential to keeping supply chains running. We also saw the impact on rice when India imposed restrictions on non-basmati rice. For example, major wheat and rice exporters, when they imposed temporary bans, raising alarm bells for import-dependent countries. While many of these measures were lifted, the initial wave created uncertainty and distorted global markets. It also reminded us just how quickly such unilateral measures can unravel global cooperation. In the context of the WTO, one of the issues we have to deal with is that when countries cannot trust the trading system, then there is the urge for them to increase production, and that leads to demands that, for greater policy space, because if the international trading system is perceived as not delivering or guaranteeing supplies, then obviously countries then want to increase domestic production by providing subsidies which may be inconsistent with their obligations under the WTO agreement. So this is something that, now it is true, WTO has been trying its best to try to address this issue. And as I just pointed out, that WTO rules recognize the right of countries to adopt measures to ensure their own food security. However, the WTO also has rules to mitigate this situation. Transparency, as you rightly pointed out, is the first line of defense. When countries notify their measures in real time, it reduces uncertainty. WTO monitoring, especially through the Committee on Agriculture, brings peer pressure and accountability. And initiatives like AMIS, supported by the WTO and other multilateral institutions, help mitigate against this kind of panic that leads to holding and unnecessary restrictions. But of course, the net food importing members of the WTO, LDCs and net food import, would like these rules to go further so that their food supply is not randomly cut off. At the 12th Ministerial Conference, as I pointed out, members reached an important decision by agreeing to exempt purchases of the WFP from export restrictions. However, the decision also pointed out that countries can do so when their own food security is at risk. We should, however, not lose sight of how interconnected we have become. A fertilizer ban in one country can reduce harvest in another. A grain export ban in one region can spike grain prices halfway around the world. That is why we need a multilateral approach to address this issue. The food system is a global commons. If we wall off trade, we do not insulate ourselves, we isolate ourselves. The WTO must be empowered to keep trade flowing. And as I just pointed out, the ongoing negotiations are very important. And we do hope that the WTO members will redouble their efforts to reach agreement, which would actually contribute to the enhancement of productivity and also to assure the food security of countries.
A very clear call for action there in terms of seeking these multilateral solutions, putting us already on, I would say, the path to the MC14, the 14th Ministerial Conference of the World Trade Organization, and that package for most vulnerable countries. You mentioned here the risks related to the policy and panic contagion. That will be one also for us to consider when we're looking at food security. We have some questions already on the self-sufficiency aspect, and I think you made a very clear point there on the risks also that self-sufficiency can create in terms of its spillovers in terms of global food security for other members of the trading system. And finally, the transparency is the first line of defense. For those who are less familiar with AMIS, that's the Agricultural Market Information System. It's really an important tool when we're looking at food security and international trade. Thank you so much, Edwini. Allow me to turn to Ambassador Boza Martinez. You mentioned the importance of innovation and sustainability in the case of Chile. What role do sustainability and climate smart trade policies play in ensuring that food supply chains are future-proof, future-ready? Because as we are striving here to feed this growing global population, and we know Chile is a large exporter, how do you see trade policy being able to strike the right balance between advancing food security, preserving biodiversity, and addressing climate change? I'd also be very keen to hear your thoughts on how you see the discussions around agricultural sustainability advancing in the World Trade Organization. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Emily, for your questions. For Chile, first of all, sustainability and climate smart approaches are not merely desirable, they are indispensable cornerstones for building future-ready food supply chains. That is why we have been already working in concrete policies and strategies in this sense. For instance, we have the National Climate Change Adaptation Plan for the agricultural and forestry sector that enhances resource efficiency and environmental stewardship. Also, the National Sovereignty Strategy for Food Security, Juntos Alimentamos Chile, launched by the Ministry of Agriculture to prioritize sustainable food systems. One example of measure contained in this strategy is to strengthen the sustainable production of traditional crops, aimed at reversing the decline in cultivated areas for traditional crops, often notably more resilient than other crops. And another example I would like to highlight is the recent Law 21600, creating the Biodiversity and Protected Areas Service. While broader than agriculture, its mandate includes implementing conservation tools and measures in areas not currently protected, encompassing management plans for threatened ecosystems and economic incentives for sustainable practices on private lands. More in general, indeed, trade policy is a powerful lever for achieving the delicate balance between advancing food security, preserving biodiversity, and addressing climate change. We have seen in the case of Chile numerous examples of interaction, as promoting sustainable standards through trade agreements, facilitating green trade, enhancing transparency and traceability, and addressing market distortions. As we have experienced the strong interlinkages between agricultural trade and sustainable practices, we supported, since the first proposal presented by Brazil, a dedicated discussion on sustainable agriculture at the WTO. I had the privilege to be one of the facilitators of the retreat that we had a couple of months ago on this, and we hope we can continue these efforts, looking how the WTO can contribute to a balanced approach that promotes sustainable and climate resilient agriculture while ensuring fair and open trade that benefits all. We believe that pragmatic and methodologically sound solutions, coupled with international cooperation, are essential to navigating these complex challenges and building a food system that is future ready. Thank you, Emily.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I think there was a good call for action here for everyone online who's going to be participating in the hackathon to seek those pragmatic and methodologically sound solutions. So that's a great starting point here. And I think your point made on how you can preserve ecosystems and enhance conservation whilst also increasing productivity levels through innovation is one that is clearly here that goes hand in hand with enhanced trade. So thank you so much, Ambassador Sophia. If I may now turn to Ambassador Hassan, you're in a region where we have a lot of smallholders and marginal producers, and we have many countries around the world who are in the same predicament. And what can we do to better their access to international markets? Is there a role maybe for international finance in all of this? What do you see in terms of the role that predictable, transparent rules in alignment with international standards can play to enable the participation of smallholders in the global trading system and therefore reach our food security goals? How can the international community pitch in to support them better?
Thank you, Emily, for that question. And maybe to start to answer your question, I think it's at least 3 questions in one. Let me start by saying that smallholders and marginal producers in LDCs continue to face major difficulties in accessing international markets, but also, as you pointed out, to access finance, including credit. And we can have that discussion maybe later, but in terms of the financing, even the debt that those LDCs have an impact on the marginalization of the producers in LDC. Besides tariff barriers, a critical challenge relates to non-tariff measures, including a wide range of sanitary and phytosanitary measures or technical barriers to trade. And I think for those of us who are in the WTO, we all know that some discussions are taking place in the WTO on SPS and TBT related to those aspects, and it's relevant for the discussion we are having today. Besides government requirements, there is a proliferation of standards and labeling requirements designed and implemented by private sector actors, including larger retailers or civil society organizations in the form of voluntary sustainability standards, or VSS, to use the acronym. Although voluntary in nature, these schemes can sometimes become de facto conditions to access certain segments of the markets. While these requirements can enable producers to receive higher prices in practice, administrative costs associated with certification, compliance, or conformity assessment procedures can be prohibitive and tend to exclude many producers in developing countries, especially smallholders. In most of our countries, there is also a shortage of accredited auditors or conformity assessment facilities, which increases the cost of audits and certification. Farmers often lack information or knowledge about different regulations or standards. In the case of voluntary sustainability standards, there is often insufficient demand and uncertainty regarding the potential price premium to justify certification compliance costs. Finally, such measures tend to reflect priorities, technological capabilities, and political consideration of the countries implementing them. They are often designed with limited consultation or attention paid to the effect on third countries like LDCs and their smallholders. While indeed it's important for food products to be of good quality and no risk to health, that's important, there is a patchwork of uncoordinated and fragmented initiatives creating complex compliance requirements that disproportionately burden smaller companies and LDC exporters. Here, the multilateral trading system already plays a role in encouraging the use of international standards where they exist and encouraging harmonization, equivalencies, or mutual recognition. LDCs require special support to achieve these objectives. It is also essential as a venue which allows members to raise specific trade concerns and discuss them with key trading partners. As we move forward, there is, however, a need for enhanced cooperation. A particular concern for LDCs is the risk that such requirements in international markets further marginalizes them in international trade. And this may require for innovative approaches to foster the diffusion, access and transfer of technology, access to finance or enhanced technical assistance and capacity building, which seems to be more and more jeopardized by the current climate, unfortunately. But this is, I would say, basic requirement that will practically assist the LDCs, smallholder, to be able to participate to the international trade system in more efficient way. And I would stop there and be happy to interact further later. Thank you.
I'm sure there will be many questions coming your way, Ambassador Hassan. And there you're saying the enhanced cooperation that we need to achieve the regulatory convergence via different instruments such as harmonization, equivalence, mutual recognition. You made a really important point, which I believe hadn't come up earlier in this conversation, which is the impact and relevance of the sanitary and phytosanitary and technical barriers to trade agreements to also enhancing food security. It'd be great to hear more about that in a second. Maybe first, though, I know we have lots of questions coming in. Please keep them coming. I will hand over to Doa here, my co-moderator, as we start taking questions from the audience.
Thank you very much, Emily. I understand that Ambassador Tihanki will need to leave us soon, so let me quickly put a question to you, Ambassador. I saw that you've engaged very actively in real time with the audience and have already responded to many questions. There is one from David Jeffrey that is specifically to do with the Philippines. So the question reads, have TRIPS flexibilities in the implementation of Article 66.2 supported the Philippines and other beneficiary countries on food supply chain resilience? If not, what is the best modality for this to be done? Keeping in mind the aspect of incentive deployment to technology owners. Word for word. Over to you.
This is one of the highly technical. At least I do know that we have not been able to use 66.2, and many actually developing members have not been able to use all the TRIPS flexibilities. And indeed, I think the question implies that while we have these flexibilities as a good thing, we need to also, since it involves innovation and intellectual property, we need innovation partnerships more than, of course, we are all for technology diffusion, but we really need to find public-private partnerships. So at least on the rice and food security, we have a very good experience with the International Rice Research Institute, with funding from both government, developing countries, and developed. So it's kind of a difficult intellectual property question to answer, and it requires really further research, and possibly our hackathoners will give us better ideas, because that has been one of the main issues, how to use TRIPS flexibilities to developing countries' advantage.
Thank you. Emily, over to you.
Thank you. We have a great question coming in here from one of our participants, and I'm gathering there will be a couple of us here that will want to respond to this question, which is a much more broader one as to why do we speak about food security? And you can see I also have that behind me here. And in relation to the concept of food sovereignty, our participant says here that food sovereignty seems to be more important, especially for LDCs. And so why is food security still relevant? Maybe can I start with you, Ambassador Hassan, maybe on the question of why food security? Why is food security important, and why are we looking at that from the point of view of an importing nation?
Thank you, Emily. Before answering that question, I want to add to the answer given by my colleague, Ambassador Manuel of the Philippines, because that question related to Article 66.2 of the TRIPS, it's mainly for the LDCs. And the whole idea is for developed countries to report on the incentives they are giving their private sector institute and so on for the transfer of technology to the LDCs. And we regularly have in the TRIP Council a workshop that to look at the notification. There is a report, but unfortunately in that report, we see a lot of information that might be important in some instances related to aid for development and any type of aid for development, but it doesn't always in a very precise way answer the requirement of notification to the incentive given by government, because they cannot themselves transfer technology. But the institutions and the private sector and the companies and so on, how are they in their interaction and cooperation and aid for development? How are they giving incentives to those who are in the position of that transfer of technology to LDCs to do so? And I think we notice in those discussions in the workshops that there a need to reply to that obligation rather than giving information that can be very generic and don't necessarily apply. And that's why you have that 66.2 proposal among the G90 proposal. And I would invite your participants to look at not only what is happening in the agriculture discussions about the food security, but to look also at all these submissions that many developing countries through the G90, which is Africa Group, LDCs and ACP Group all together, submitting this proposal for negotiations to see how those flexibility can be made operational and effective. Let me put it that way. And it applies here also for and I think, Emily, you talked about building resilience and including through innovations. And I think this speaks also to the transfer of technology I was mentioning earlier. But this already, we have a framework that is requesting from developed countries to give incentives to their company and institutions to do so. So I just wanted to add that. And maybe to come back to your question about food security versus food sovereignty, if I'm correct. I hope
that was correct. It was, why do we speak of food security and why are we not putting more emphasis on food sovereignty?
I think it's more about, if I were to look at from that perspective, more of a political approach. If you are talking, and I think more and more countries are looking at the discussion in food security, when we are in the context of WTO, we don't talk much, and maybe your participants will realize it if they look at how we discuss in the WTO. We don't talk much about food sovereignty. We talk about food security because it's more, but outside of WTO, the discussion on food sovereignty is happening. And for many countries, including LDCs, because of the two shocks, I think it has been mentioned earlier, the 2008 financial crisis and the impact it has in terms of the bill for food staples in the LDCs. And sometimes when these prices goes up, they remain up for a while. And even after the crisis, the immediate crisis, they remain high. And the second one, the crisis that was a wake-up call also, was the COVID-19. And more countries now are looking at the perspective of the food security, because if you also put in parallel another terminology, why we talk about addressing food insecurity rather than addressing food security. That's another terminology as well. And I think that the nuances are also linked to the political approach that we have to the whole issue of food sovereignty. And that's why I would say that the conversation is taking place outside of the WTO and not in the WTO yet.
Very interesting insights there, and also to see the linkage there between food security and food affordability, productivity. You touched upon it, Edwini, very quickly there earlier in your intervention on this question of food nationalism, and I gather that's also where we're coming from a food sovereignty perspective. Would you have a couple of words before I turn over to Doa for the next question?
Certainly. I think, as Ambassador Kadra just pointed out, in the WTO, the discussion is more about food security rather than food sovereignty, because when you talk about food sovereignty, it implies that countries should have the flexibility even to produce where it's unsustainable, because that's the concept of food sovereignty. You produce all your food needs. And we all know that is not possible because, whether for climatic conditions, the cost of production. So it is in that regard that the WTO, we put emphasis on food security, because it's a fact, no one country can on its own produce all its food needs, whether coffee or something. It's a tropical product. Norway cannot produce coffee, or for that matter, other Scandinavian countries. So food security basically, and I think the discussion here in the WTO is how do we strike a careful balance? On the one hand, giving policy space to countries to be able to provide for their food needs, while at the same time not distorting trade. And that has been why we have been negotiating for all this. It is true that some members feel that the WTO current rules limit them, because currently for many developing countries, they are only restricted. They can only provide support up to 10% of the value production of a particular product. So that is their de minimis. Whereas it's not applicable to countries with AMS. And so a lot of countries believe there's that imbalance, that countries like United States, Canada, Australia, Brazil, and others, because they have AMS, they have greater flexibility, whereas most developing countries don't, those who do not have AMS. So this is something that we are debating. In the context of the current round, some countries have put forward proposals that they should be allowed to exceed their de minimis of 10%, which is 10% for most developing countries, although some developing countries like China, they agreed to 8.5% during their session. So we are currently having that debate as to how we can give more scope of flexibility to countries. But at the same time, in as much as countries realize that we may have to adjust WTO rules, there is also the concern that if countries were to have greater leeway, it may also lead or produce unsustainable outcomes. For example, developing countries under Article 6.2, they can provide unlimited support. And this may result in negative environmental externalities. So we need to be very careful in terms of the scope. But I think all WTO members are very conscious that the current rules need reform, but we should do it in such a way as to enhance productivity rather than maybe employing more land or clearing land, and then it will exacerbate the climate crisis. But how to strike a careful balance is what we are trying to do in the agriculture negotiation. So food nationalism or food sovereignty, as Ambassador Kadra said, we don't talk about it at the WTO, but in the UN, and it is also in the constitution of several countries like India and the rest. But I think even most countries agree that trade plays an indispensable role. And as Doha pointed out, 1 out of 3 or 4 calories are traded. And so when we talk about food sovereignty, it kind of diminishes the role of trade, whereas food security underlines the importance of trade. Because, if we have a global system which would empower people to have money, that will enable them to have access. And I think affordability and access are key. And having a robust multilateral trading system which provide opportunities to countries would enable us to satisfy all the facets of food security.
Thank you very much. We move to the next question. There is a question that asks about the role and responsibility of businesses and corporations involved in international trade and the realization of the right to food. What is the role of businesses and corporations in ensuring the right to food through trade? Ambassador Sophia, would you like to take a stab at that?
Thank you, Doa. If you allow me, I would like to add something to what has been mentioned about food security and food sovereignty. And also now we have another concept, which is right to food. So I think it's becoming more and more rich discussion about the different concepts that they interact. But reflecting about food security and food sovereignty, well, first of all, joining what Winnie said, that when we think about food sovereignty, is implied somehow that there is some kind of self-sufficiency. And when we talk about food security, we say that we have enough food available, that we have enough food affordable, and that food is fulfilling requirements of quality, of food safety, but that food can come from our own producers, internal producers, or being imported. So that's, I think, the main difference among the two concepts. And that's a discussion that we have had in Chile. A few years ago, we started to think about those two concepts and how we can we could connect them. And that's why, as I mentioned before, we have this strategy, food security with sovereignty, in which we try to connect both. We are a food export powerhouse, and we want to continue being that. And we want to use our comparative advantages, and for those products that we need to import them, okay? However, at the same time, we are worried about some challenges that we have for our food security. For example, the high levels of obesity that we have, overweight. And as I mentioned before, we want a food system that is more inclusive. And there, we have been thinking about this food sovereignty, but not this meaning that we are going to limit our exports or our imports, but how we can support more some sectors, some agricultural sectors that have been sometimes negatively impacted by some production shifts. For example, the case of traditional crops, cereals, legumes, that decreased through the years because others as fruits increased. So we have tried, I wanted to address that question because we have tried to look at both concepts and look at how we can take advantage of both of them without decreasing our implication in international food markets. Having said that, about right to food, and I think when we think about all these concepts, finally, we always arrive to how our food system work. And that food system, we can look at it from the national, regional, or global perspective, as we are looking at in this seminar. So I think when we look at the food system, we have to recognize that we have many actors that are interacting at that food system. Government, we have consumers, but we have as well, as the question is mentioning, we have companies, we have entrepreneurs. Those are in charge of the innovation, those are in charge of the production, those are in charge of the transportation. So of course, they are very relevant, and how they are included and how they interact with the food system, global, regional, or national, is very relevant for the results that we will have. And those results are food security, maybe some elements of food sovereignty, and of course, right to food. So we need to look at how different actors are interacting at the food system in a way that we increase those goals that are, especially in our case, food security and right to food.
Thank you very much. Edwini, let me ask you maybe for a comment from your side on how the WTO interacts with business and corporations.
Thank you very much, Doa. To start with, I think we all accept that the WTO is an intergovernmental institution. However, the rules are there to be exploited by businesses. So I think that is the starting point. However, I think it is important for us to, and I think we have been doing that, engaging with the private sector. But one thing that the WTO cannot do is to regulate businesses or tell them what to do. But I think a lot of companies do realize their global responsibility. And some of them have been doing their best, whether providing free seeds, giving technical assistance and capacity building. And I think that cooperation should be encouraged, and the WTO actually encourages that, because like Sophia said, we need all the actors in order to have a responsible food system. The WTO alone cannot do it. Neither can the UN or the FAO, but we need a collaborative approach, as well as bringing businesses on board for them to realize the importance of having a system which would fulfill the SDGs. I think there was a question on the SDGs, and I think it is quite clear that, you know, the food system, it touches on so many SDGs, including 2 on zero hunger and the rest. So I think we need a collaborative approach, and the idea that maybe WTO can regulate, we cannot do that, but we can certainly encourage collaborative efforts so as to be able to deliver for the world.
Thank you. Emily, over to you.
We have a very interesting question here from Janice, who's asking, to what extent can global food value chains be restructured to incorporate stronger environmental sustainability criteria without marginalizing the small scale producers in developing countries? And I know that that's one that comes up often in conversation. I see Ambassador Sophia nodding here. Maybe I can ask you for your first remarks.
Well, thank you very much, Emily. Maybe my cat will appear in the screen because he is surrounding. So sorry if that happens. I was noting because we have had this in our discussions. I remember this retreat that they have mentioned about sustainable agriculture. And there, as facilitator of one of the breakout sessions, I could see how, especially for developing countries, LDCs, it was important to make the remark that sustainability also includes the social side. So in that sense, I would say that we are looking not only for sustainable food systems, but also sustainable and inclusive food systems. So that's a challenge. I do not have the response for that, even if I have been researching about this for more than a decade. But I think it is important to acknowledge that for many countries, both things go hand in hand. Inclusiveness of food system, but as well sustainability, environmental sustainability.
So a great reminder there that we have 3 pillars to sustainability, which also include those social and economic pillars. And I think that will probably speak to you, Ambassador Hassan. We're talking about the inclusiveness factor here. You represent the LDCs in these discussions. How do you see this point of ensuring that whatever we're building is not marginalizing small-scale producers?
Thank you, Emily, for that question. I think the issue of inclusiveness is related to the right to food. And it happened that I'm not an ambassador to the WTO only, I'm a UN ambassador as well. And one of the, I would say, gap that we see when we are in the WTO is that all those aspects of Agenda 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the human rights and the right to food and right to development discussions that are taking place on the UN side are definitely not captured in the WTO. So I think it speaks this issue of, and I think Sophia mentioned that this discussions that are taking place are very much linked to the human rights aspect of the right to food. What are the 4 key elements of the right to food? Availability. Food should be obtainable from natural resources, either through the production of food, by cultivating land or animal husbandry, or to other ways like fishing, hunting, or gathering. Food should be on sale in markets and shops. So it's a broader kind of availability. And what are the sources? The second aspect of the right to food is the accessibility. It must be affordable. Food must be affordable. Individuals should be able to have an adequate diet without compromising on other basic needs, such as school fees, medicines, or rent. So it's the whole approach of having access to the right food is part of what we call the human rights, or economic human rights and cultural rights. The third aspect is the adequacy. Food must satisfy dietary needs, taking into account a person's age, living condition, health, occupation, and so on. And it should be safe for human consumption and free from adverse substances. And the fourth one is the sustainability. Food should be accessible for both present and future generations. So the right to food from the human rights perspective englobe all these aspects. Do we discuss those aspects in the WTO? In short, I would say no. Maybe when we are discussing, and the most difficult discussion we are having in the WTO is the reform on agriculture. I think Winnie can speak to that. But as from the perspective of member states, this is the most difficult discussion we are having, to look again at the agreement of agriculture. And I think those aspects need to be taken into account. But as I said, in WTO, we are really very much in silo and very narrow perspective when we are discussing and when we want to address the rules that speak within a certain network and framework. So maybe this is the time to look at how we can expand the framework and the network as well by the stakeholders that can be party to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Kadra. I will now move to our last question, since we only have 3 more minutes remaining in this webinar. It's from a good friend of mine, Chris Hagedorn. Hello, Chris, wherever you are in this virtual space. Chris Hagedorn, who is the former secretary of the Committee on World Food Security at the FAO, is asking the following question. He's saying much attention is being directed to the concentration of corporate power and control over the global food system. Food price speculation is also a significant problem. In light of all of this, how is the WTO dealing with anti-competitive behavior and trends? Edwini, over to you.
It's true, we do see private restraint to trade, but the WTO only regulates governmental measures and not actions of private companies. If you recall, at the first WTO Ministerial Conference, we had wanted to address competition policy, but there was no consensus on that in the organization. And we had a working group on competition policy. It basically fizzled out because there was no consensus among the membership. And there are many reasons for that. A lot of WTO members do not have competition policy, so they thought that the time is not right. But we do see increasingly that some regional trade agreements, especially the new generation ones, they have robust provisions on competition policy, but one can never rule out that the WTO would be asked. We have seen work going on in UNCTAD, in the OECD, so maybe in the near future, this is certainly, because sometimes private restraint is even more than governmental restraint, and I think it's a legitimate issue which we need to consider going forward.
Thank you very much, Edwini. It is exactly 3:30 p.m. and time for us to close this conversation. It's been an incredible conversation, and I hope as hackathon participants can see, there is an incredible number of concepts that are at play here, from food security to food sovereignty to right to food, to the issues of trade distortion and the concentration of our food production in the hands of certain corporations and so on, and just an enormous number of issues that we could debate, I think, for a very long time. But unfortunately, the discussion does have to draw to a close now. I'd like to thank our wonderful panelists and my wonderful co-moderator, Emily, for the job that she has done here. And I'd like to thank, of course, the Geneva Trade Platform, Dimitri, who made the opening remarks in the beginning and who has collaborated with us in creating this hackathon, as well as somebody from the Geneva Trade Platform who's played an incredible role behind the scenes in making this happen, Juanita Calibala. So thank you to all of you for being here for this important rendezvous and this important conversation. And I can't wait for the hackathon to happen and for the jury to deliberate. Goodbye. Goodbye.